Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Wednesday, Yom Revi'i. Let's light up the darkness. And I apologize, I was a few minutes late getting started. We had the road show on Monday, and then we were traveling yesterday, and I forgot that when I got back home, I was going to have to reconfigure everything. So we're late because of me. My fault. I'm sorry. Okay, let's get back to it. Who's in the house? Yehud in South Carolina, Bill in Missouri, Joe in the Inland Empire, Paula in the Great Northwest, Stephen in Maine, Shandor in the Bronx, Melissa in Great Neck, Sharon in Las Vegas. You're going to have fun. Bella in Florida, Lucy in Minnesota, John in Maine, Chaim in Florida, Aoife in Florida, Ella's in the house, Vince is happy to be here. Aoife, I just signed up for the app. Is the live broadcast program not broadcasting through it? It should be broadcasting through it. Yes, we have the app. The Accidental Talmudist app, is available let's just see this. It's pretty cool. It's awesome. And it is available, and it's available. You can get it, and you can consume all of our content that way, and it's beautiful and super cool. And now I'm just wondering if you're doing the live stream. Yeah, it's totally cool. Happening. It's awesome. It's totally happening right there. So yeah, it's on. It's happening. So yes, Accidental Talmudist app now available in the iTunes store, and I believe an Android Google Play also. Need to check that. Sorry, I'm very crazed. We are also, I can announce just here among us, our friends, that our movie will be having its world premiere. Coming right up, actually, this came together quickly. I think I mentioned it before, but it's on Wednesday, June 19th in Los Angeles as the opening night gala. It's a red carpet world premiere as the opening night gala of the Los Angeles Jewish Film Festival, our movie Guns and Moses. So that the website, Nina will put it in the comments, but it's the tickets are not for sale yet. They will be very soon. But the festival has already announced it on its website, lajfilmfest.com. lajfilmfest.org, lajfilmfest.org. So if you can be in LA, if you're already in LA, we would love to see you at the premiere of our movie, Guns and Moses, on Wednesday, June 19th. Okay, let's do this. Okay, so our daf today is page 88 here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. We are continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 7. Generally speaking, the subject is that the Torah provides that when a worker, a laborer, is working, it specifically says that if he's in your vineyard, right, picking your grapes for you, or in your field, right, harvesting your grain for you, that while he's doing that, he may eat the grapes or eat the grain that he is harvesting. And so now the Gemara is testing and trying to understand the limits of this law and what other contexts it applies in. So for example, what about your laborer who's milking your cows? Does the same law apply to that person? Can that person drink some of the milk while milking your cows? And the answer is no, and then we'll see why that is. And what about the baker's assistant, who is rolling and kneading and baking the dough? Can he eat from that while he's doing that job? I'll leave you in suspense. Okay, so here we go. We pick this up at the bottom of page 87b. Rabbi Yanai says that the owner of untithed produce is not obligated in the mitzvah of tithing, now on page 88a, until it sees the front of the house through which people enter and exit, and it is brought into the house through that entrance, as it is stated in the formula of the declaration of tithes. I have removed the consecrated from the house, Deuteronomy 26:13, which indicates that the obligation to tithe produce, whose purpose has not yet been designated, applies only when it is brought into the house. Now, why are we talking about tithing? Weren't we talking about whether or not the worker can eat of the produce while he's working in the field harvesting it? And so the connection is once it's being tithed, so that means that the work is finished. Right? There is no more work to do. So once the obligation to tithe the produce kicks in, that means that the work is done, and therefore there's no worker working on harvesting the produce. So once it's subject to tithing, then this allowance for the worker to eat of it would no longer apply. So let's see how they work this through. So when is it considered that the produce is harvested and subject to tithing? So since the Torah says, I have removed the consecrated from the house, this indicates that the obligation to tithe produce whose purpose has not yet been designated, whether it was consecrated or not, applies only when it is brought into the house. Now that's Rabbi Yanai's opinion. His student, who became the great Rabbi Yochanan that we've been talking about, Rabbi Yochanan says, even bringing produce into the courtyard of the house determines that the production process of the produce has been completed, and that the produce is therefore subject to tithing, and therefore not available for the worker to eat of it, because he can't eat of something that requires tithing and has not been tithed. Nobody can eat of it. Once it requires tithing, you can't eat of it until it has been tithed. And that's why we would say the workers can no longer eat of it. You can obviously pay your worker with food, or you can invite them to eat food, but they don't have a right to that food once the work is complete. So Rabbi Yochanan says it doesn't have to actually come in the door of your house. It's enough that it comes into your courtyard. As it is stated in the confession of the tithes, like when you're doing your tithing, it says, Deuteronomy 26:12, and I have given to the Levite, to the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, and they shall eat in your gates and be satisfied. That's part of the formula of the language that one speaks while he's tithing. And so eat in your gates suggests it doesn't have to be literally in your house, but once this produce has been brought within your courtyard, that should be enough. So the Gemara asks, but according to Rabbi Yochanan, also, isn't it written from the house, which we use to decide, to say that only once produce comes inside the house, is it required to tithe of it? And the Gemara answers, well, Rabbi Yochanan could have said to you that the term house is not to be taken literally. Rather, it indicates that bringing untithed produce into a courtyard is similar to bringing it into a house in the following way. Just as a house is a secured area, so too the courtyard must be secured. An area that is accessible to the public is not considered a courtyard for the purposes of this law. And the Gemara asks, and according to Rabbi Yanai also, isn't it written in your gates? And the Gemara answers, that term is necessary to teach that this law, that the production process is considered complete, right, vis-a-vis the labor and whether he can eat of it or not, applies only when one brings the produce into his house through the gate, i.e. the entranceway. And this is to the exclusion of produce that was brought in through rooftops and enclosures, in which case the produce is not subject to tithes, at least not by Torah law. So Rav Chanina Chozah raises an objection from a statement of the Baraisa mentioned earlier. And just while we're sort of hashing out this stuff, let me just read the simple statement of the law that we're talking about. It'll just make things a little bit clearer. This is how the law ended up. Untithed produce becomes subject to the laws of tithing only when it is brought into one's house, provided it is brought through the entrance. If, after the produce has been brought into the house, one ate from it without separating teruma, right, the first tithe that goes to the priests, and tithes, which are the next two tithes, right, the next 10% goes to a Levite, and the next 10% after that is the second tithe in 4 of the 7 years of the sabbatical cycle. And it's the poor man's tithe in 2 of those 7 years, right? So if one brought produce into his house via rooftops or other enclosures, by Torah law, it is exempt from the laws of tithes. By rabbinic law, there are 6 possible criteria which subject untithed produce to the laws of tithes. If the produce is brought into one's courtyard, that means you have to tithe it at that moment. You're obligated. If it is purchased, right, bought and sold, if it is cooked, if it is pickled, if teruma is separated from it, and if Shabbos arrives. So it's not like you have some kind of unlimited amount of time. Once the produce is done, you need to tithe it, right? And the things that will require you to tithe it immediately is if you start the tithing process, right, by making teruma, or if you want to start cooking with it, right? If you're going to start bringing it into food prep, it has to be tithed before you do that. So by Torah law, just when it comes into your house, but by rabbinic law, there's several other factors that kick in the obligation to have that food tithed. All 6 criteria determine whether the produce is subject to the laws of tithing only after the completion of the produce's work. So when it's standing in the field, or when it still needs to be threshed or winnowed or sifted, or any of those steps, it's not subject to tithing because there's still all these steps until the produce is considered complete, right? That the grain is ready, to be bought and sold as grain, etc. If you still have these other steps to do, well, then your workers are still working on it, and they can eat from it because the tithing obligation has not yet kicked in. So let's keep going. All right, so now they're arguing, right, Rabbi Yana and Rabbi Yochanan, about whether by Torah law, is it enough to bring it in the house? Does it have to be brought into the house before tithing becomes necessary, or is it enough to just bring it into the courtyard? Rabbi Yana says house, Rabbi Yochanan says in the courtyard is enough. So the Gemara asks, so according to Rabbi Yana also, isn't it written in your gates? I'm sorry, we've read that. Rav Chanina Chozah raises an objection from the statement of the Baraisa mentioned earlier on page 87b, that the term kenafshecha, which means at your own pleasure, can also mean as you are. Why is that important? The term kenafshecha teaches that just as the law is concerning the owner of the vineyard himself, so is the law concerning the laborer himself. Meaning, just as the owner alluded to by the term nafshecha may eat from the produce before its labor is complete and is exempt from separating tithes, so too the laborer himself may eat and he is exempt from tithes. Now the objection of Rabbi Hanina Chazah is like this. This indicates that only an owner and a laborer may eat from produce without tithing it. But one who buys produce is obligated by Torah law to separate tithes before partaking of it, presumably even if its manufacture is not complete. Or actually, all 6 criteria determine whether produce is subject to the halos of tithing only after the completion, right? So even one who's purchasing it, if he purchases it before the manufacturing is complete, like sifting, winnowing, etc., then he doesn't have to tithe it either until those steps are done. Okay? But one who buys produce is obligated by Torah law to separate tithes before partaking of it. And what? Is it not correct to conclude that this is the law even when he purchased the produce while it was still in the field? So this is going to be wrong because this contradicts what we just read as the final halacha. If he's buying it while it's still in the field, there's still processing to do. So even though he has purchased it, that food doesn't become subject to tithing immediately because we still have to finish the processing. What is it not correct to conclude that this is the law even when he purchased the produce while it was still in the field, i.e. that he's obligated to tithe produce even though it has not entered his house or courtyard? And Rav Papa said, here in the Baraisa we are dealing with a fig tree that is standing in a garden outside a courtyard, and its leaves are leaning into a courtyard. Or if we're talking according to the one who says that the obligation to separate tithes applies when the produce is brought into the house, right, Rabbi Yanai, then let's say that there's a fig tree outside, but its branches extend through a window into the house. So the fig is still on the tree and it's inside the house. So then what? Therefore, the produce has entered the courtyard or the house. And the Gemara asks, well, if so, the homeowner himself, not only the buyer, should also be obligated to separate tithes as the produce is either in the courtyard or in the house itself. And the Gemara answers, the homeowner's eyes are on his fig tree, i.e. his primary concern is the tree, not its produce. And the main part of the tree is outside the courtyard, right? It's not in the courtyard, it's beyond the courtyard, just the branches extend. But the buyer's eyes are on his purchase, i.e. his focus is on the produce itself, which is in the space of the courtyard or the house. So maybe he does have to tithe if he purchases it, even though it's still on the tree. And the Gemara asks, and is a buyer obligated by Torah law to tithe the produce that he purchases? But isn't it taught in a Baraisa? For what reason were the shops of Beit Chino, a town near Jerusalem, destroyed 3 years before the destruction of Jerusalem itself? It was because they based their practices strictly on matters of Torah, i.e., they did not adhere to the rabbinic decrees. They only followed the written laws that were in the Torah. This sounds pretty much like the Sadducees. Now, the Gemara explains that they would say, now we're on page 88b, that a buyer need not tithe the produce that he purchases, as derived from the verse, you shall tithe all the produce of your planting, which is brought forth in the field year by year, and you shall eat before the Lord your God. That's Deuteronomy 14, 22 and 23. So these people of Beit Hino, who ended up, being destroyed 3 years even before Jerusalem was destroyed, so we're saying that their practices were sinful, that they claim that the phrases, you shall tithe and you shall eat, indicate that only the one who eats the produce must tithe it, but not the one who sells it. And likewise, the phrase, the produce of your planting, teaches that the one who performs the planting must separate tithes, but not the one who buys it. So rather, the obligation of a buyer to separate tithes applies by rabbinic law, and the verse is cited as a mere support for this law. And the residents of Beit Hino did not adhere to this rabbinic law and did not observe the law requiring the buyer to separate tithes. They did that, but they were wrong. Now, it was stated previously that a buyer is not required to tithe produce by Torah law. A buyer is not, the way that the farmer is. Now, if so, that's by Torah law. But the rabbinic decree comes along and says, no, he has to. Now, if so, the same certainly applies to a laborer. Consequently, the term kenafshecha cannot serve to teach that a laborer may eat without tithing as claimed earlier. And the Gemara asks, rather, what does kenafshecha come to teach? And the Gemara answers, it comes to teach that which was taught in a different baraisa, that kenafshecha can mean like your own person. Just as with regard to your own person, meaning the owner, if you muzzled yourself and did not eat from your field's produce, you are exempt from liability for the transgression of, you shall not muzzle an ox when it is treading out the grain. Deuteronomy 25:4. So too, with regard to a laborer, if you muzzled him, i.e. you did not allow him to eat, you are exempt from liability for the transgression of muzzling an ox while it is working. Now, you wouldn't muzzle your worker, but even creating the same condition where you just order him, don't eat this food while you're working here. Now, that would violate that. We've already said that the harvester, while he's harvesting, can eat, right? Whether it's the grapes in the vineyard or the grain in the field. But if you said to him, don't eat, right? And so you muzzled him by giving him an order like that, you would have violated that law, but you would not be violating don't muzzle an ox while it is threshing, because muzzling an ox refers to an ox, not a human. Mar Zutra raises an objection from a Mishna, Masrot 1.5. Now, with regard to different types of produce, what is the equivalent of their granary, i.e. the point at which the processing of various types of produce is completed so that they become subject to the laws of tithing? With regard to cucumbers and gourds, right, it's not so simple. We've been talking about grain, okay? You're harvesting wheat, you know that you cut it from the field, you're going to separate, all the large stuff, the small stuff, you're going to do the sifting and winnowing, etc. And so we end up, right, with these, bulk piles of grain. But what if you're harvesting vegetables? Are we going to say that as soon as the vegetables are harvested and placed in a pile, they're subject to tithing? I mean, there's no further processing to do the way that, if you're going to turn grapes into wine, or if you're going to turn grain, even just make it into bulk grain, it requires processing. But cucumbers and gourds, I mean, as soon as you pick them, they're done, right? So what's going on here? With regard to cucumbers and gourds, they become obligated from when they lose their blossom. What does that mean? And Rabbi Asi said this means from when their blossom, known as the pikas, is removed. So the Gemara clarifies the objection from the Mishnah. What is the Mishnah saying? Or what is the objection now that's being brought from this Mishnah? What? Is it not correct to say that the Mishnah means from when they lose their blossom, even while the produce is still in the field? And this would mean that the produce is subject to the laws of tithing before it enters the house or the courtyard, which is not in accordance with the opinions of either Rabbi Yanai or Rabbi Yochanan. Now, it might still make sense since they don't require any processing. But it would seem like, but didn't the Torah say from when you bring it into either your house or at least your courtyard? Definitely if once it's in the house, and possibly even when it reaches the courtyard. But here they're saying that no, it means from when it loses its blossom. Well, it could lose its blossom right as soon as it's picked and it's piled in the field. So does the tithing kick in while there's a pile of cucumbers and gourds out in the field? Or do they have to be collected and brought, sort of into a protected area, whether that's your courtyard or your barn or your house or something like that? So the Gemara answers, no. The Mishnah means from when they lose their blossom, specifically in the house or the courtyard, i.e., the house or the courtyard renders the produce subject to tithes only when the produce loses its blossom. So yes, it does have to come into the house. It does have to come into the courtyard, or at least into the house. But that doesn't mean it's already subject to tithing. There's actually an additional step, which is when it loses its blossom. So the Gemara asks, if so, the phrase "from when they lose their blossom" is inaccurate, as the Mishnah should have said "until they lose their blossom." The expression "from when they lose their blossom" indicates that the obligation applies as soon as the blossom comes off, before the produce even reaches the courtyard or the house. By contrast, the expression "until they lose their blossom" indicates that the obligation the obligation to tithe does not come into effect until the cucumbers or gourds have been brought into that secure area, and on top of that, they lose their blossom, right? Like the flowers or whatever, that blossom is lost from the vegetables. So the Gemara answers, had the Mishnah taught "until they lose their blossom," I would have said erroneously that the produce is not subject to tithes until their loss of blossom is complete, i.e. until all of the produce loses its blossoms. The expression "from when they lose their blossom" teaches us that the obligation to separate tithes from these kinds of produce takes effect from when they begin to lose their blossom, right? So they have to come inside the house or the courtyard, and they have to begin to lose their blossom, and then they become subject to the laws of tithing. And that would mean that the workers can no longer eat of them. Now, Mar Zutra, the son of Rav Nachman, raises an objection from a Baraisa. With regard to produce, its granary for tithes, meaning rendering one who eats it liable for violating the prohibition against eating untithed produce if it hasn't been tithed, is from when its work is completed. And what is meant by the completion of its work? This means the work of its being brought in, not just whatever processing you do out in the field, but also the work of bringing it into the courtyard or bringing it into the house. So the Gemara discusses the meaning of being brought in. What, is it not correct to say that this is referring to its being brought into a pile even while the produce is still in the field? And the Gemara says, no, it means that it's being brought into the house. This is considered the completion of its work. And if you wish, say instead, when Rabbi Yana and Rabbi Yochanan say that the types of produce are subject to tithes when they are brought into the house or courtyard, they were referring only to olives or grapes, which are not of a granary, i.e., since these types of produce are not processed in a granary, which is the typical criterion for rendering produce subject to tithes, they become subject to tithes when they are brought into a house or courtyard. But in the case of wheat or barley, a granary is explicitly written with regard to them. See Numbers 18, 27, and 30. Therefore, they are subject to tithes in the granary even before they are brought into the house or courtyard, right? Because they're secured in the granary. New subject. The Gemara returns to its discussion with regard to the right of a laborer to eat while he's working. So we found the source for the law that a person may eat from attached produce while working in the field, right? While he's harvesting the grapes, he could take a grape off a tree. Or while he's harvesting apples, he could take an apple off a tree and eat it, okay? Because he's working on your stuff, and the Torah provides for him to eat of that attached produce while he's working in the field. And likewise, we found from a source that an ox that is threshing must be allowed to eat from detached produce, right? So the ox that's walking around the threshing floor using its hooves to crush the grain, that's the threshing. So it can eat, right, the grain that's on the floor, and it's forbidden, it's prohibited to muzzle the ox so that it won't do that, right? So don't muzzle the ox while it's threshing. So that's detached produce, right? The ox is not threshing produce that's attached to the ground. It's already been harvested. So from where do we derive that a person, while he's working, may eat from detached produce, right? So they're harvesting all this grain. If he wants to, now there's something that has been already cut down, can he just, if he likes to eat raw grain off the stalk of wheat, can he do that once the stalk has already been cut down? And the Gemara answers, this is derived by Kal V'chomer inference from the case of an ox. And if an ox which one need not allow to eat from attached produce, right? You only don't muzzle it when it's on the threshing floor. So we're talking about detached produce, but you don't have to, you're not prohibited to muzzle an ox while it's working among attached produce, like when it's plowing for you, or not plowing, but like if it's pulling a wagon through the field, and you're loading, the cut produce into the wagon, you can muzzle that ox because that's not talking about detached produce on the threshing floor. So, and if an ox, which one need not allow to eat from attached produce, must be allowed to eat from detached produce, then with regard to a person who may eat from attached produce, and it is prohibited to stop him from doing that, is it not right that the laborer, the human laborer, may also eat from detached produce? Now, the Gemara rejects this inference. What is notable about an ox? It is notable in that you are commanded concerning its muzzling. Can you say the same law can you say that the same law should apply to a person? We're not commanded to muzzle or not to muzzle a human. The Torah doesn't speak to whether you muzzle or not muzzle a person. And the Gemara asks, but let an employer be commanded concerning a person's, i.e. his laborer's, muzzling from the kal v'chomer inference of an ox. And if, with regard to an ox, you are not commanded to sustain, as there is no mitzvah to support an ownerless ox if they do not have food to eat, you don't have to feed an ox that's ownerless, and yet you are commanded concerning its muzzling, then with regard to a Jewish person whom you are commanded to sustain, if he is impoverished, is it not right that you are commanded concerning his muzzling, that you may not muzzle him? The Gemara is sort of like pushing the logic a little bit. This doesn't really make sense. We wouldn't talk about muzzling a person, but we're just testing how we can derive one law from another. Now the Gemara answers, the law that one is not commanded concerning the muzzling of his labor. Now you might say it would be humiliating, it would be wrong for many different reasons, but all the Gemara is saying right here is that the Torah does not say explicitly you shall not muzzle a human while he's working for you. The Torah does say you shall not muzzle an ox on the threshing floor. So, the law that one is not commanded concerning the muzzling of his laborer is derived from the fact that the verse states, kenafshecha, which indicates that just as you treat yourself, so is the law with regard to the person of the laborer. In other words, you could muzzle yourself, right? If you thought that you're incapable of sticking to your diet, and so you muzzle yourself, the Torah doesn't prevent you from doing that. And so likewise, you could say the Torah doesn't prevent you from doing that to another person. Now, if you're humiliating them or making them suffer, you're violating a different commandment. But there is no commandment that says you may not muzzle a person. So in other words, just as with regard to himself, the owner, if you muzzled yourself, you are exempt from punishment for violating the transgression of you shall not muzzle an ox, because it doesn't speak to muzzling humans, whether it's yourself or someone else. So too, with regard to a laborer, if you muzzled him, you are exempt from punishment for violating the transgression of the law, don't muzzle an ox. After refuting the kal v'chomer inference, the Gemara asks, so rather, from where do we derive that a person may eat from detached produce, right? That is the law. The person who's working for you can eat produce, whether it's attached or detached from the ground. So that's kind of, equitably speaking, where we want to end up. The question is, what is the source in the Torah for that? And the Gemara answers, the proof comes from this. The verse states the term standing, like standing grain, but it says the word standing twice. When you come into your neighbor's standing grain, but you shall not move a sickle on your neighbor's standing grain. So if the second expression is not applied to the matter of the right of a person to eat from attached produce, as that law has been derived from the first mention of standing, so we apply it to the matter of the right of a person to eat from detached produce, and that the worker can eat that as well. So Rabbi Ami stated an alternative answer. A verse is not required to teach the right of a person to eat from detached produce. You don't even need a verse. As it is written, when you come into your neighbor's vineyard, then you may eat grapes. Are we not dealing even with a case in which the employer hired the laborer to transport the grapes out of the vineyard? It means they've already been detached from the vines, and yet the merciful one states that the worker may eat. So obviously detached produce is included. The Gemara asks, well, from where do we derive that an ox must be allowed to eat from attached produce. How do we know that? And the Gemara answers, this is derived by a kal v'chomer inference from the case of a person. And if a person who may not eat from detached produce, i.e., there is no explicit verse that permits him to do so, nevertheless may eat from attached produce, then with regard to an ox, which must be allowed to eat from detached produce, is it not right that it must also be allowed to eat from attached produce? And the Gemara rejects this inference. What is notable about a person? He is notable in that you are commanded to sustain him, right? Your brother, you have to make sure he doesn't starve to death. But an ownerless ox, I mean, you have a big heart. You're not going to want to watch that ox starve to death. But you're not legally obligated to feed that ownerless ox. You could let somebody else do it. Or the ox will find its way, somewhere where there's grass that it could eat. You're not obligated to feed an ownerless ox. What is notable about a person? He is notable in that you are commanded to sustain him. Can you say that a similar law should apply to an ox when you are not commanded to sustain it? And the Gemara asks, but let one be commanded to sustain an ox to prevent the suffering of any living creature. And we use the kal v'chomer inference from the case of a person, like this. And if, with regard to a person where you are not commanded concerning his muzzling, nevertheless you are commanded to sustain him, then in the case of an ox where you are commanded concerning its muzzling, that you not muzzle it while it's threshing, is it not right that you are commanded to sustain it? If indeed an ownerless ox is starving to death, you are commanded to feed it? But the Gemara rejects this. This cannot be the case. As the verse states, and your brother shall live with you, Leviticus 25:36, which indicates that the mitzvah to provide sustenance applies only to your brother, your human brother, but not to an ox. After refuting the kal v'chomer inference, the Gemara inquires, rather, from where do we derive that an ox must be allowed to eat from attached produce? And the Gemara answers, the verse states the term your neighbor twice. If the second expression is not applied to the matter of the right of a person to eat from attached produce, as that law has been derived from the first mention of your neighbor, apply to the matter of an ox, that it must be allowed to eat from attached produce. So this would seem that if you're bringing your ox-drawn cart into the field so that you can, pile stuff into the wagon, and the ox, wants to eat some of the produce as it walks by, you would have to let him do that. Ravina said, verses are not even necessary, either for the law that a person may eat from detached produce, or for the law that an ox must be allowed to eat from attached produce. As it is written, you shall not muzzle an ox in its threshing. Now consider, all matters, meaning all animals, are included in the law of muzzling, as we derive a verbal analogy from the term ox stated here and the term an ox with regard to Shabbos. Just as the prohibition against having one's animal perform labor on Shabbos applies not only to oxen but to all animals, you can't have your animal do work for you on Shabbos, as explicitly stated in the Torah, so too the law of muzzling includes all animals, not merely oxen. If so, and the term ox in this verse does not limit the law to that animal alone, then let the merciful one write in general terms, you shall not thresh while muzzling. Why do I need the word ox that the merciful one writes? It is to juxtapose and compare the one who muzzles to the muzzled animal, and likewise to compare the muzzled animal to the one who muzzles, meaning its owner. So just as the one who muzzles, the human, may eat from produce attached to the ground, so too the muzzled animal may eat attached produce. And just as the muzzled animal may eat from detached produce, so too the one who muzzles may eat from detached produce. So bottom line, if you're working with food that's being harvested that is not yet ready for tithing, you can eat from it, whether it's attached to the ground or not attached to the ground. And if your ox is working beside you, he can eat of it, whether attached to the ground or not attached to the ground. The sages taught another exposition with regard to the wording of the verse, you shall not muzzle the ox in its threshing. And the verse mentions threshing. So just as threshing is unique in that it applies to an item grown from the ground, and it is performed at the time of the completion of its work, like when it's being harvested. You don't thresh the following year, you thresh when you harvest. And a laborer may eat from it. So too, with regard to any item that is grown from the ground, a laborer may eat it. And this serves to exclude one who milks a cow, one who makes butter from cream, and one who makes cheese from milk, as these are not grown from the ground, and therefore a laborer may not eat them. You might want to allow him to, but you're not obligated to let the laborer eat from these dairy products that he's involved or she's involved in processing, because the law in the Torah about allowing the laborer to eat, from the detached or attached produce is only about plants that grow from the ground, not other kinds of edible food that is, comes out of the udder of a cow, for example. And by the way, we're on page 89a now. I'm just getting a head start on tomorrow when, God willing, we'll do a double daf. So the Gemara asks, why do I need this exposition? This law can be derived from the words in the verse, when you come into your neighbor's vineyard. Deuteronomy 23:25, as these actions are not performed in a vineyard. Milking a cow is not performed in a vineyard. The Gemara answers, well, it was still necessary to state this law, as it might enter your mind to say that since the merciful one writes, standing in Deuteronomy 23:26, and as explained earlier, this serves to include all items that stand, i.e. produce of all kinds, whether it's gourds or cucumbers or wheat or barley, one might have thought that it also serves to include items that are not grown from the ground, like milk taken from a cow. And the Tana therefore teaches us that this law applies only to food that grows from the ground, not food that comes from other places, right? So plants it applies to, not non-plants. It is taught in another baraisa, and from the ground. So I suppose mushrooms would be counted like plants, even though they're not plants. They come from the ground, but if we're talking about meat or dairy, then no. It is taught in another baraisa with regard to the same term, threshing, that just as threshing is unique in that it applies to an item that is at the time of the completion of its work and a laborer may eat from it, so too with regard to any item that is at the time of the completion of its work, a laborer may eat it. This serves to exclude one who weeds garlic and onions, i.e. one hired to remove the wild growths from among garlic and onions. And the reason is that since it is not the completion of their work, a laborer may not eat from them, right? So it's interesting. If you're picking garlic and onions, then you can certainly eat the garlic and onions while you're doing that work. You can't take garlic and onions home with you because that would require tithing, and you're not entitled to do that. You can just eat while you're working with them. You can take one out of the ground and eat it, or you could take one out of the basket and eat it because you're involved in harvesting the garlic and onions. But if what you're doing is picking weeds out of the ground from between the garlic and onions, then you're not harvesting the garlic and onions, and you don't have a right to eat the garlic and onions, right? That's a different kind of job. The Gemara asks, why do I need this exposition? It can be derived from, but you shall not put any in your vessel, which indicates that if the laborer does not place the food into the owner's vessels, he is not permitted to eat it. That's the difference between weeds that are being taken out of the field and onions and garlic that are being harvested. The Gemara answers, no, but this was still necessary to state because even though he also plucks and removes the small ones from between the thick ones, and therefore the work of the small garlic and onions has been completed, nevertheless the laborer may not eat from them, as this is not the completion of the work of the entire field. Right? So that's interesting. If the part of growing garlic and onions was that you went through and removed the small ones that are underdeveloped and that are going to just take up space and create a problem for the bigger, juicier bulbs to reach their full growth. You have harvested these tiny onions and garlics, but those you don't eat because you're not harvesting them for the purpose of the owner selling them. You're really just weeding them out because they're small and not going anywhere. And it is taught in another baraisa concerning the term threshing, that just as threshing is unique in that it applies to an item whose work is not yet completed for tithes, and a laborer may eat from it, so too with regard to any item whose work is not completed for tithes, a laborer may eat it. And this serves to exclude one who separates dates and dried figs, which are initially gathered together and stuck to each other before the laborer splits them apart with a rake. And the reason is that since its work is completed for tithes when it has been gathered from the field, a laborer may not eat from it, right? Like this already was tithed. And then, like it was brought in from the field, it was brought inside, and then they separated tithes from it. And then there's some more processing to do, but it's post-tithe processing. And once we're post-tithing, then the laborer doesn't have a right to eat of it by right of Torah law. And the Gemara raises a difficulty. But wait a minute. Isn't it Torah Baraisa with regard to one who separates dates and dried figs? This laborer may eat from it. And Rav Papa said, well, when that Baraisa is taught, it is referring to unripe dates, which are plucked before they are ready and placed on the ground in order to ripen fully. And the work of these fruits has not yet been completed, even after they are separated from each other. They're not subject to tithing yet, so that people who do this work can eat from them. Whereas people who bring it to the stage where it's ready for tithing, then if there's more work to do after that, they cannot eat from it because it's already reached the tithing stage. It is taught in another Baraisa with regard to the same term, threshing, that just as threshing is unique in that it applies to an item whose work is not yet completed for challah, right? Taking challah, the little offering that you would give to a priest when you're making bread, okay? So that is, it's not tithing, but it is, right? It's like tithing. You have the same obligation that, when you're kneading a certain, like let's say 5 pounds of flour to bake bread, that you would take some of that dough out. That's called challah, the challah offering, which you would have to give to a priest. We don't do that anymore. We do remove challah if you're making enough, a big enough batch, but we don't give it to the kohanim. Nevertheless, what about this? What about the fact that it's like a tithe? So are you going to say that the baker's assistant, right, who is helping the baker bake bread, and it hasn't reached the challah, stage yet, is he able to, eat from that dough that's in the kitchen? So too, with regard to any item whose work is not completed for challah, a laborer may eat from it. But this serves to exclude one who kneads the dough and one who smooths it over with water and oil and one who bakes, as its work is completed for challah, and therefore a laborer may not eat from it. And the Gemara raises a difficulty, but why do I need this law? Hasn't its work already been completed for tithes when the produce was brought inside the house? If you're already baking bread with it, it was already turned into flour, so that labor could eat at that time, and then it was tithed. So what are you talking about that the laborer can eat of it now? Challah comes later. It's not a tithe. It comes much later. So why would you even think that the worker could eat from it? It was already stated that once the work of turning it into sellable grain and brought into the house, and then tithing kicks in, that workers can no longer eat of it. And the Gemara answers, this is not difficult, since in this Baraisa we are dealing with places outside the land of Israel, where there is no obligation to tithe at all. And the Gemara raises the difficulty, well, if so, that this is referring to a place outside of the land of Israel, the obligation to separate challah also does not apply. Rather, the ruling in the Baraisa is actually stated with regard to the land of Israel, and it is not difficult that it is referring to those 7 years in which they conquered the land of Israel, right, when the children of Israel first walked out of the wilderness and into Canaan, and the 7 in which they divided the land of Israel, and they were obligated in challah, but they were not yet obligated in the separation of tithes. The Gemara challenges this. Is the obligation to separate tithes the decisive factor with regard to a laborer? That is not the case, as the completion of the work is the decisive factor, while the obligation to separate tithes is mentioned only because it coincides with the completion of the work. It's like a marker, but it's not really dispositive. It's the completion of the work that means the laborer can no longer eat from it. And usually that's when the tithing kicks in, but it's not because the tithing kicked in that the laborer can no longer eat. Even if there is no mitzvah to separate tithes, nevertheless, the work is completed at the same stage. So rather, Ravina said, I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. So rather, Ravina said, one should combine the two baraisas and teach them as one. as follows. With regard to the term threshing, just as threshing is unique in that it applies to an item whose work is not yet completed for tithe, in the case of most produce, and an item which is not completed for challah, in the case of species of grain, and a laborer may eat from it, so too with regard to any item whose work is not completed for tithe or for challah, a laborer may eat of it. So, we're just going to leave it there. But I'll just mention that there's no challah outside of Eretz Israel, outside of the land of Israel. By Torah law, the obligation to separate challah applies only in the land of Israel. And only the majority of the Jewish people are living in the land of Israel. But the sages decreed that one must separate a small amount of the dough or bread, even outside of the land of Israel, and burn it. Why? So that the laws of challah are not forgotten. That's where we'll leave off, and we'll pick it up tomorrow, God willing, at the regular Thursday time, 6 p.m. Pacific, right near the bottom of page 89a, and therefore we'll be able to do a double daf since we're a few pages behind. Okay. Monica Erin Ferlito. That's a new name. Welcome, Monica. Regarding the fig tree with its branch inside the house. So, both people own the fig tree? What if the tree leaned into the property of a non-Jewish person? That's a wonderful question. Wonderful question. If your neighbor has a fig tree and its branch grew, so that it was like sticking into your property, certainly like over your courtyard, and what if it even grew so it was like literally inside your house or inside your porch, let's say, can you be said to be the owner of that tree? I think not. I think it's still owned by, the person whose property the tree is in. But the question is, let's say you have permission from your neighbor to pick fruit from what, grows over your side of the fence. I think most neighbors would do it that way. And maybe, I'm not even sure offhand, maybe it is considered that if it's over your property, you can take from it. The question is if you sell it, if you sell it, but it's still on the tree, is it subject to tithing at the time of the sale? Because selling triggers the obligation to tithe. And it's an interesting question because it hasn't even been picked off the tree yet. So certainly there's no tithing before it gets harvested off the tree. And so it seems, and that's what made it an interesting question. But I, I don't know the answer to your question. Are you considered the owner of the fruit that is growing on a branch that comes in over a fence? For sure, the Talmud talks about this. I just can't remember offhand. But good question. Joseph, isn't one of the meanings of tithes that it must be the first? Are there exceptions? I'm not quite sure what you're asking. But if a type of food is obligated in tithing, then before you can eat from it, it has to be tithed, right? And so the order is always the teruma, the first 2% to the priest, and the next 10% to the Levite, and then the next 10% is Meiser Sheni, either for yourself, right, to take it with you to Jerusalem for a pilgrimage festival, or to sell it so that you have money to pay for what you're going to eat and drink when you go on the pilgrimage festival, or in certain years that second tithe is given away to the widows and orphans and other poor people who need it. And yeah, that tithing process has to happen because if you eat untithed produce after the time when it is obligated to tithe that produce, that if you eat untithed produce before it's obligated in tithing, that's what we're talking about. The worker in the field, that food, he can eat it even though it's untithed because the law to tithe hasn't kicked in yet. But once that law kicks in, if you eat untithed produce, that's a big avera. That's a big transgression. Now, in modern times, we definitely don't have tithing the way we did. There is some tithing that is done similar to in the way that the challah obligation still exists, not in the same way when challah was given to priests, but when women make challah, if they make enough of it, like 5 pounds of flour, they pull out a little ball of it, they burn it, and then usually dispose of it, around Passover time. They don't give it to a priest, but we keep this ritual so they can say right. You say the bracha, right? And Nina can answer that. You guys say the bracha when you take the challah out, or at least I think you do, right? And likewise, there's a kind of vestigial tithing that still goes on. I think in Israel, and not for all kinds of produce and not under all conditions. I am so far from being knowledgeable, let alone expert in these matters. But it's easily researched. You know, if you're curious about this, just Google, Meiser or tithing in Israel in modern times. Monica says the blossom turns into the fruit. Is that when it's lost? When it turns into fruit? I don't think that's what they're talking about. You know, because they're saying it has to be harvested. So, like, if you're telling me like zucchini, there are zucchini flowers, right? And then later the zucchini emerges. And I don't think they're sort of at the same time. So when they're talking about losing its blossom, it must mean something else, because, you know, like let's say cucumbers. The cucumbers or gourds have been harvested. They're brought into the house, and there's still like another step. And basically what that other step is, I think what they're saying is it has to ripen just a little bit more, begin to ripen a little bit more, and then it's subject to tithing, not necessarily as soon as it's brought into the house. So what they actually mean by losing its blossom is just some other little bit of waiting. The point is that you just have to wait. It's not that you have to do something to it the way that we winnow and sift grain. Joe says the blossom or petals don't always fall off at fertilization. Many times the blossom will stay attached to the fruit or vegetable until we remove it at harvest or preparation. Thank you, Joe. Thank you for sharing your expertise. I appreciate that very much. Okay, that's what we've got for us today. And with God's help, tomorrow, Thursday, regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, we'll do a double daf and start getting caught up.